All right, so moving along here. So the real secret to being able to use your DNA results for genealogy is this idea of cousin matching. So we want to confirm that the genetic relationships between people make sense. We're going to look at the DNA and we're going to look at our traditional genealogy research and make sure that those two things match. So the first thing we want to do is find someone on our match list who we know, not one of these unknown people, not one of the strangers, but somebody that we know. And I'm just going to use for as a sake of example, my second cousin, Christine. I know who she is. I know how we're supposed to be related. Her grandfather and my grandmother are brother and sister. So we want to confirm that the amount of DNA that Christine and I are sharing is appropriate. And do we share the right amount of DNA to be second cousins? Well, there's a couple ways to figure that out. The first is to look at this chart. This was created by Blaine Bettinger, and his website is called thegeneticgenealogist.com. And he periodically updates this as he gets more data from people, but it's organized pretty neatly. You're the one in the middle, the self there in the middle. And then each box represents all of the different relationships that you can reasonably expect to share DNA with someone. And these values are shown in centimorgans. A centimorgan is a unit of measure for DNA. The larger the amount, the more closely related you are to a person, more than likely. And it's shown as a range. And that is really important because although you inherit half of your DNA from each of your parents, you don't necessarily inherit 25% of your DNA from each grandparent. So it's possible that you can share more DNA with one grandparent than another, or more DNA with one aunt than another, more DNA with one sibling than another. You can share more DNA with some of your cousins, some of your second cousins than another person who has the same relationship. And you can share more DNA with your uncle than your brother or sister does. That's just the way that it works out. So for cousin matching, we want to determine that the amount of DNA that I share with Christine is appropriate. Is it within the range? And she and I share 326 centimorgans. And this box right here represents second cousins. And the average is 229, but the range can be anywhere from 41 to 592. So 326, very neatly within that range. Pretty likely that we are probably second cousins like we thought we were. The second method, and this is the one that I like to use, I think it's nice and quick, is using a little tool over at DNA Painter. This is an independent tool that was created by Johnny Pearl, and there's some really cool stuff on here. I'm a subscriber to this site, but you don't have to be. A lot of the stuff on here is free. And the thing that I'm going to show you right now is free. We want to click on Tools and WATO. That stands for What Are the Odds? So we want to click on that, and it will take us here. We get a menu of tools to choose from, and we want the Shared Centimorgans tool. Because we can just, this looks suspiciously familiar. We've got Johnny Pearl's tool includes Blaine Bettinger's table under it. But what we want to focus on is this box right here, where we can just enter the amount of DNA you share with somebody. And then on the bottom, it will show us all of the possible relationships for that amount of DNA and what ones are more likely. So I popped in 326, and I'm zooming in a little bit here for you so you can see it better. We can see second cousin is in fact a really likely relationship for someone who shares that amount of DNA. And if we scroll down the page, it will show us, if you're a more visual person, it will highlight the boxes, darken the boxes that contain 326. So in either way, we can look at this and we can see that second cousin is possible and in fact a probable relationship between the two of us. But there's one other thing that we do need to look at. And this is really important. Just because Christine and I share the right amount of DNA doesn't mean that we're second cousins the way we think we are. she could actually coincidentally be related to me another way, not necessarily through her grandpa and my grandma like we think. What we want to do is take a look at the people who share DNA with both of us and make sure that those common matches are the ones that they quote unquote should be. So how do we see those matches? Well, if we're looking at Ancestry, other websites also offer this tool, but I'm showing an Ancestry example just because they're by far the most common DNA tests that people have taken. So I'm playing the odds here that everybody watching has more than likely taken an Ancestry DNA test or planning on taking that particular test. But for different websites, the path to get there will be slightly different. If we're on Ancestry, we want to click on our match's name. This page comes up and we want to click on this Shared Matches button right here. And then we get a list of all of the people who shares DNA with me and with Christine. So this is how I think Christine and I are related. I believe that we are descended from our great-grandparents, William and Mabel, which means that everybody on this list should be related to William, Mabel, or both. In the case of Christine and I, we're related to both of them. So if we take a look at this list, Vivian is the daughter of William and Mabel. SF is their grandson. Leon is Mabel's nephew. Norman is Mabel's great nephew. Rebecca is another second cousin. I could continue down this list of shared matches, but you're getting the point. These people, Christine and I are matching all the people we thought we would. So more than likely, we share the right amount of DNA to be second cousins. We're matching with the people we are expecting to match. The odds are pretty good that William and Mabel are our great grandparents. And just using a DNA test for just me and Christine and one or two other people, I added our other great aunt here, Vivian, to the list. Every one of these relationships is probably right. The most likely explanation for Christine and I sharing the amount of DNA we do and matching all those other people is that Melanie is Christine's mom, William is her grandfather, and William and Mabel are her great-grandparents. And Dan is more than likely my dad. Annie was my grandma. This wouldn't work out probably if that wasn't true. That's the most likely explanation. Well, and that was a pretty close relationship, so it was a kind of an easy one to do. We'll do one a little bit farther out. This is a match that my mom has on 23andMe, and I recognized him right away. This Gary character, I believe, is her third cousin. And we can't see this chromosome browser on 23andMe anymore. I don't know if they're ever going to bring it back, but they bury that centimorgans total a little bit on the website. And we can see that my mom and this Gary share 120 centimorgans. I went over to DNA Painter, plopped that in, and third cousin isn't the most likely relationship, but it's definitely a possible relationship and certainly not an unexpected relationship. So even though there are others that are maybe more likely, third cousin isn't out of the realm of normal. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. The amount of DNA is appropriate. And so I looked at the shared matches. They call it relatives in common over at 23andMe. We get a whole list here. So this is how I think my mom is related to Gary. It goes back to their great-great-grandparents, Gottlieb and Henrietta up there. So everyone on that list should be related to one of those two or both of them. And that's definitely the case. Alan is descended from that couple. Mark is descended from them. James is Mark's brother. Kathleen is descended from them. This whole list is all descended from that couple. So this is pretty promising. The amount of DNA they share is reasonable. They're matching the right people. So I added the other path to some of those other matches to kind of illustrate that they're all in this together. More than likely, this guy is my mom's third cousin, and all of the other relationships in between are probably correct too. And I say probably because let's say, just for the sake of argument, that Shirley, my mom's mom, let's say her dad was actually one of Leon's brothers. this would still all look right. So DNA tests like this are not very good for detecting non-paternity events within the family. They'll spot it if it's somebody from outside the family, but if it's someone from within the family, you might not notice, because if Leon's brother was actually Shirley's dad, my mom would still be Gary's third cousin. So we wouldn't catch a non-paternity event like that, but those aren't very common. So we'll just assume that Leon really was Shirley's dad. But I think confirming research is great. It is definitely comforting to all of us to know that the people we believed were our ancestors are indeed our ancestors. But I think the real thing that we're looking for is trying to find new ancestors and go further back in time and solve those mysteries, break down those brick walls. And the secret to that is definitely people you don't know. When you don't recognize one of your DNA matches, that could be the person who is the key to unlocking that door. So this particular match, this Mrs. Schur, popped up to me a few years ago, and I had no idea who this woman was. For one thing, she's not using her real name. She's using a username. So that makes it a little harder for us to figure out who this person is. But I could see how much DNA she was sharing, 58 centimorgans. So that's in the neighborhood of, fourth cousins, something like that. So probably the common ancestor here is about 5 generations back. So this is getting pretty far back in time. Now, luckily, she does have a family tree with 88 people in it. Maybe there's something in there that can give us a clue. And of course, if you recognize your match, you would add them to your tree if you want to, or you can just ignore that like I did, since I didn't know who she was. So the first step is to figure out how she belongs to my family. Where does she likely go? So I took a look at her family tree just to see if I would recognize anything. And unfortunately, most of those 88 people are not her ancestors. She must have a lot of cousins in her family tree, nieces and nephews, grandchildren, that kind of thing. And since we know the common ancestors probably 5 generations back, her family tree hasn't gone far enough. It hasn't gone far enough back for me to be able to figure out how she's going to connect to me. So we're probably going to have to do a little bit of digging. Now, the first thing I do want to point out is that this isn't actually my DNA. This is actually Dolores. She was my grandma's last living first cousin. And you might be thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, why would you test somebody who's that far away from you? But it's because Dolores's ancestors, half of them, are my ancestors. Everyone on her dad's side of the family is also my family. And this DNA match actually didn't match me. We don't inherit DNA we don't match all the same people as our family members. We don't match the same people as our brothers and sisters or our parents. And the more people you test, the more matches you're going to get. And so that is why I asked her to take a test, and I was so glad that I did, because a few years later she died, but I'm still able to use this DNA test to discover more ancestors. So I went to the shared matches here and clicked on that to see a list. And the good news is that I knew these 4 matches. Bernice and Sarah are mother and daughter. And then JL is a first cousin to Gary's dad. So they're kind of a little bunch. And then Bernice and Sarah are a pair. And the reason I know that is because I've done a lot of genealogy, the traditional genealogical work. You really do, in order to use your DNA matches, you have to document the descendants of your great great aunts and uncles and your distant relatives, because your great great grandmother has not taken a DNA test. But the children and grandchildren of your great aunts and uncles, your great great aunts and uncles, those are the ones who are appearing on that list, the people who are alive today. So that's who we want to be finding, is the people who are alive today and getting them in our family trees. So I have done a lot of digging in obituaries in the census to figure out who all of these DNA matches are. So Bernice and Sarah are descended from this couple right here, this Peter and Maria. And since we expect this Mrs. Schur, her ancestor, to be 5 generations away from Dolores, we can be pretty certain that Mrs. Schur's ancestors are probably the next generation past either Thor and Kari or Ole and Ingeborg. They're probably this next group of people here. And Gary and JL are descended from this pair, from Ole and Ingeborg. So that means Mrs. Schur is probably descended from the parents of either Ole and Ingeborg, or either Ole or Ingeborg, descended from one of their parents. That's probably who she's descended from. So I know that Ole and Ingeborg were from this little town in Norway, and I know they were born, in the late 1700s. So their parents were probably born in the 1760s, 1770s, something like that. And they were probably from the same place that Ole and Ingeborg were from, because in the 1800s, people weren't quite as mobile as they are now. So I know that that's geographically where I probably need to be looking. So the next step is to go back to the match and say, okay, I kind of know where I think our connection is. Let me look at your family tree and see if I can find some of this. And so the hypothesis is that she's descended from this couple who lived in this little town in Norway, this Naeseth, and were living there in the 1790s. But it looks like her mother's side of the family is probably Norwegian. Those names appear to be Norwegian. And when I clicked on this man, it said that he was from Hedmark, which is where Ness is. So I thought, well, this is kind of promising. She thinks she has family from kind of that same geographical region. But of course, her family tree is only going back to the 1830s. And I suspect that our common ancestor was from the 1700s. So really, our common ancestor could be through any of those branches. So I reached out to her because I thought, well, maybe she knows more about her family than what she's showing here. Or maybe she's got, a cousin who's really into this and she can connect me with that person. And believe it or not, she replied to me. I sent her a connection request through Ancestry, sent her a message, and she replied. And she said, well, I know that my grandmother came from Stavanger, Norway. I know my grandfather came from Oslo. And she said that's all she knew. So if we take a look at them this is just from Google Maps, we can see Stavanger is pretty far away from Ness, but Oslo is pretty close. And she said that in her family tree, it says her great grandfather was from Hedmark, which is where Ness is located. So that's where I started with the good old fashioned genealogy. Life isn't fair. So I made her family tree for her because I really wanted to know, how are we connected? So I just started looking through Norwegian church records, looking at the census, going back in time. I went back several generations for her, and I found a couple that was born about the same time as Ole and Ingeborg, and I found them in Ness, right where my ancestors were. She has ancestors in the same place that I do. So these were her ancestors. They were born in the 1790s, just like I thought they would be. So laying my ancestors beside hers, I have 2 couples born at the same time in the same place. And in the 17 and 1800s in Norway, they used the patronymic naming system. So when you see 2 people with a name in the middle like that, that's Anderson, both of them are Anderson, their fathers have the same first name. There's a reasonable chance these 2 men are brothers. Now, it could just be a coincidence because any 2 guys with the name Anders would have sons named Anderson. But I thought, aha, we may have just found the connection. Maybe these 2 guys are brothers. And Ole Anderson is basically the John Smith of Norway. That is a very, very, very common name. I have like 70 of them in my family tree. It's extremely common. And when Ole got married at that time in Norway, they didn't record the parents' names on the marriage record. So I had no idea what his parents were named. And Norway took a census in 1801. They didn't take another one until 1865. So I could find Ole Anderson on the 1801 census with his family, but there were 6 little boys the same age with the exact same name living in that town. I had no idea which one was him. And I had thought, I will never know. How will I ever confirm which one of these 6 Ole Andersons is mine? I really had no idea how I would figure that out until I had this DNA match. I said, I wonder if one of those Ole Andersons has a brother named Jens. And by golly, there was only one. This is a transcript. The census is handwritten, but there was only one family. There were 2 little boys in this household, the right age with the right name. I found the right family. And there's one other Norwegian naming tradition then that helped me kind of nail this down. In Norway, it was customary at this time for sons to name their first daughter after their mother. And both Jens and Ole, their oldest son's name was Viveka. Viveka is a very unusual name in Norway. So the likelihood of there being another Viveka other than their mother is pretty unusual. So I felt pretty confident that I had found my ancestors. And I never could have done it without this DNA test from my grandma's cousin. Then I was able to continue in the church records and go back a few generations on my family. So this was a case that I took a look at for actually one of our members at NAGC. She came to us and said, I have an ancestor named Minnie Thompson, and I have no idea where in Norway she's from. I don't know anything about her before she got to the United States. And her paper trail in the United States wasn't very good either. Her marriage record didn't tell who her parents were. The only reason we had a maiden name for her was because when her children got married, they said, my mother's name is Minnie Thompson, or sometimes they would say Wilhelmina Thompson. And we only have a birth and death date for her because that's what's on her headstone. And of course, we all know headstones are perfect. So we were really not sure. And Minnie Thompson is not a Norwegian name. Neither of those, that's not a Norwegian first name, that's not a Norwegian last name. But on every census, when she was asked, where are you born? She said Norway. So we were fairly certain she was from Norway, but we really weren't sure what name we would be looking for in Norway, other than we knew it was not Minnie Thompson. So I asked this member, we looked for better paper records too, and we couldn't come up with anything. I said, I think DNA might be your only choice. And luckily, she'd already taken one. She'd already taken a DNA test with Ancestry. So she gave me access to her matches, and I started taking a look at it. And luckily, Minnie was her only Norwegian ancestor. So it was pretty easy for me to separate out her DNA matches. If they had no Norwegian ancestry, I wasn't interested in looking at them. And I started identifying the people I did recognize as part of her known family. And I started finding a bunch of Norwegians that I couldn't connect to her family tree. I didn't know how to do it. So I started giving them all blue dots, light blue dots. And I found 55 people who were sharing DNA with each other. Most of them had, I shouldn't say most, a lot of them had family trees with Norwegians in them. And so I started taking a look at all of their family trees and seeing how all of these people were connected to each other. What did they have in common? And I found that a lot of them were descended from this particular couple. These people were born in the mid 1700s. So I knew these couldn't be Minnie Thompson's parents. They were much too old. But I thought, with all of these people being descended from this couple, those are probably, our customers, our members' ancestors too. And based on the amount of DNA that she was sharing with all of these matches descended from this couple, I figured that Moritz and Helga here were probably Minnie's great grandparents. Like that's how far away Minnie was from these two. And so I needed to connect those dots. I needed to figure out who are Moritz and Helga's great grandchildren. So I found all of their children, I found all of their grandchildren, and I found all of their great grandchildren. I was looking for a little girl born around 1870 whose name might get Americanized to Minnie Thompson somehow. And that took me about 20 hours probably to go through and find all those people. But there was, luckily, they only had one great granddaughter who fit that bill. Her name was Tomina Tonnesdottir. And it was very time consuming, but we found her. And I never would have been able to find that without a DNA test. I mean, there was just not a paper trail. An 1890 census would have been really helpful here, but we all know we're not going to get one of those. So we had to go another route, and we were able to make that leap and figure out what her name was in Norway. And then once we started building this family tree, we started finding other DNA matches who were descended from like farther back branches. And I said, oh, good, this all makes sense. This is the right person. This was another one that landed in our laps at the library. Someone came in, their ancestor's name was Oliver J. Davis, and they just couldn't figure out where he came from in Norway. You know, he was always claiming to be Norwegian on the census and things like that. But here's another one. Oliver Davis is not a Norwegian name. I've never seen a single person with the name Davis in Norway in my life. So we knew this was a name that he had picked up on his own somewhere in the United States. And this case had actually been investigated by a lot of professional genealogists. And I'm not here to criticize Ancestry's pro genealogists because I got to see the work they did and it was good, but it was very obvious to me that this person who did this research didn't know anything about Norway. So it's really important when you're looking for a professional genealogist to find somebody who has the right expertise. This person from Ancestry knew a lot about the United States, but it was obvious to me that they knew nothing about Norway. And they wasted this person's money. They really did, because they didn't come up with anything. So it is really important, if you're going to hire a professional, to find the right one. Don't ask me to do your Japanese genealogy for you. I don't know anything about that. But if you want to talk about Norway, give me a call. I know a lot about that. We got lucky with a couple of records. His naturalization papers show his name as Ole J. Davis. And I said, well, that's definitely a Norwegian name. That's probably the first name he used in Norway. And his son's marriage record had him down as having the middle name John, Oliver John Davis. And so we said, well, maybe that J, maybe that is something like Johan or Johannes. Those are pretty common names in Norway. Maybe that's what that stands for. If you love black sheep, you would wish this man was in your family. He was married several times. At the same time. He had multiple wives at the same time, a lot of brushes with the law. It was really fun to follow him through the United States. So maybe the fact that his paper trail was contradictory and clouded was intentional, because he didn't want to be found by all of his families. He was on the run a little bit, but it was fun to track him down. And so we got, this possible Ole John, but we still were just like, there's nothing connecting him to a place in Norway. And we said, have you done a DNA test? And she said, actually, I have. And so she gave me access to her DNA results. And I started sorting everything into groups like I did with the Minnie Thompson situation. And most of her family lines were pretty easy to document and well documented. And she only had one line of Norwegian ancestry, and that was this Oliver. And so I put everybody who looked to be Norwegian in this orange group, gave them an orange dot, because I figured these have to be related to Oliver Davis since they don't belong anywhere else. That's what makes sense. There is an aspect of Ancestry's DNA test that can be pretty useful, and that's the genetic communities. And I can't speak for every ethnic group because I don't get to look at, a lot of German results or French results, things like that. But I get to see a lot of Norwegian DNA results. And these genetic groups, these communities are really good. They, in this particular test, it said that she belonged to this Nordland and Troms community, which I very poorly outlined with the red line there. But that's where they said her ancestors were from. And I noted that a lot of her DNA matches claimed to have ancestors from this little town called Muirana, which is where I put the red star, which is right in the middle of that circle, basically. So I thought, aha, I have a feeling her ancestors are from that place. Her DNA is pointing to that area, and a lot of her DNA matches are claiming to be from that area. And in particular, again, she had a lot of DNA matches descended from this couple, Christian and Elsa. And Oliver was about the same age as this couple, so I knew they couldn't be his parents. And based on the amount of DNA that she was sharing with all of the descendants of this couple, I thought that Oliver was probably a first cousin to this one of these two, not both of them, but either Christian or Elsa was probably his first cousin. But of course, I don't know which one. So we had a little bit of work to do. And luckily, I'm not the only one who works there. So a couple of us went to town on this one. We found all of Christian's and all of Elsa's grandparents. And because we figured that would have to be Oliver's grandparents too. So we found all of their grandparents. And then we had to come down looking for all of the grandchildren of all of the grandparents because we were hoping to find an Ole John or something like John, who was born about 1865. And they did have two grandsons named Ole, but one of them was born in 1859, so he was a little bit too old. One was born right in 1865. And the one born in 1865 was actually named Ole Johan. And I said, aha, feeling pretty good about that. And Ole Johan was Elsa's first cousin. So we already knew that our client was sharing DNA with the top part. That was very evident. We're like, okay, Elsa is descended from that family. We know that he shares DNA with that family. But I could not find anything in her DNA matches that connected her to the other side of the family. And so I thought, oh, maybe Ole Johan isn't Oliver J. Davis. Maybe that's not him, because they should be connected to that family too. And I just couldn't find anything. So I went back to her because I could see in her DNA matches that she had a brother who had taken a DNA test. So I said, can I see your brother's DNA matches? And at first she said, my brother? I don't have a brother who took a DNA test. And I was like, uh-oh. I thought I felt safe with that. You have the same last name and the same family tree. And she says, oh, Bob, I forgot he took a DNA test. I said, oh, thank goodness. So she asked her brother to give me access to his matches. And when you take a look at the amount of close DNA matches, Bob has almost 200 more close DNA matches than his sister does. And they're not identical twins. They do have different DNA matches. So I went through all of his DNA matches, hoping to find a connection to this side of the family. And I did. He had several DNA matches who were connected to that half of the family. But until I took a look at his DNA, I wasn't confident that I'd found the right one. There was a real nagging thing in the back of my mind saying, oh, maybe you haven't found it. Maybe Ole Johan is not Oliver Davis. We never did figure out where he came up with the name Davis. I don't know if that was someone he just met along the way, because he was definitely Ole Johan Anderson in Norway. So we don't know where the Davis came from, but we did figure out who he was and where he came from. But if we hadn't had two siblings' DNA, I don't know if I would have been able to, bang the gavel and say we did it. We figured out who he was. So for most of us, the primary value that we're going to find with a DNA test is just confirming that our ancestors and our other family members are the people we always thought they were. But we may be able to find new ancestors by researching the ancestors of our DNA matches who, sometimes have a clearer paper trail than ours. And in all cases, cousin matching is that secret sauce. You need to be utilizing those people who share DNA with you and figuring out what you have in common so that you can find those mysterious, elusive common ancestors that you didn't know about. So did anything interesting come up in the chat that we should address?
Right.
Oh,
I'm fully on that too.
okay. Well, let's see, Q&A. Would that be under more? Oh yeah, look at that. We got 4 in here. Oh, looks like we have tech issues here. Oh, somebody has a question about explain that shared DNA info again. Well, I'm not sure exactly what they mean by that, but the more DNA that you share with a person, and it's quantified in centimorgans, so the more you share, the more closely related you probably are. Let me just go back to that chart. Back to the big one. There it is. So you can see that relationships that are closer, like parent and child, you share, over 3,000 centimorgans with your parents and your children. And with your brothers and sisters, it's probably more like 2,500 centimorgans. And as you get farther out in that far right column, like sixth cousins, there's a very real possibility you won't share DNA with a sixth cousin at all. Even if you have, a very clear paper trail, you just may not have inherited DNA from your common ancestors. And really, at the fourth cousin level, it's even about a 50-50 chance. About half of your fourth cousins are not going to share DNA with you at all. But your brothers and sisters may, because we're not identical twins. Well, some of us are. If you're an identical twin, your match list is probably going to be very, very close. But if you're not identical twins, your match lists are going to be very different. Your close matches will be the same, but as you get farther down to those more distant relationships, some of your brother may have some people on there that you don't. Your cousins may have some people on there that you don't, and vice versa. DNA is very predictable, but also very random. So you can share more DNA with one uncle than another uncle. You can share more DNA with one grandparent than another grandparent. And I hadn't really appreciated that until I tested all 3 of my children and all 4 of their grandparents, and it was so obvious. My son actually shares twice as much DNA with my father-in-law as he does with my mother-in-law. And you would not expect that. You would expect it to be very, very close, but it's not. He shares twice as much DNA with his grandpa as he does with his grandma. And that's just how it goes. And that's why when you look at your ethnicity results too, they're not going to be the same for your brothers and sisters as they are to you, because you don't inherit the same things from your ancestors. So your ethnicity estimates are going to be different too. And we don't think of our DNA that way at all, but that's really the way it works. We think of brothers and sisters as being the same, but we're actually quite different, or we would be identical. So hopefully that addressed the question. Get the Q&A back up here too. Oh, somebody says here that, is there one test or another that seems to yield more information for those of us who have Norwegian ancestry? That's a great question that I can actually answer quite handily. I like those genetic communities at Ancestry. My heritage is starting to do something like that. Theirs isn't quite as robust as Ancestry's yet, but I would say that down the road, maybe they'll be just as good. But for now, Ancestry has those communities really pinpointed. If they're telling you you have a connection to a place in Norway, I haven't seen them get it wrong yet. They're nailing it. They're doing a really good job. But the one thing I love about my heritage, if you have Norwegian ancestry, is that's the Norwegian nationals, people in Norway, that's the test they're taking. You are probably not going to see a lot of matches on your ancestry list from Norway. This is going to be Americans and Canadians and, some Australians. But on Ancestry, about a third of my DNA matches are from Norway. Or I'm sorry, on MyHeritage, about a third of my matches are from Norway. So if you're looking to connect with Norwegian cousins or European cousins in general, MyHeritage is a great test for that. Let's see, someone says here, I have Eastern European grandparents who immigrated at the turn of the last century, but don't have the towns and details of arrival. Any tips for when you haven't nailed down old country information and there may not be a wealth of records due to wars, etc.? Yes, Eastern European is hard. And with more recent, turn of the century, that's not so terribly recent. The more recent your ancestors have immigrated, the fewer DNA matches you're going to have generally on that side of the family. When your ancestors came in the 1840s or the 1700s, you're going to have a lot of DNA matches in this country. But if they didn't come till after 1900, you're not going to have nearly as many. But I would take a look at those genetic communities. And if you haven't tested with MyHeritage or transferred your results to MyHeritage, I would do it. Because like I said, the Europeans like to take the MyHeritage test. So I think testing over at MyHeritage might be a great place to check. All right. Oh, someone's got a question about my comment that DNA is both predictable and random. So imagine a woman in 1800 who had 6 kids. Is it possible that mother over time might not pass on any DNA and essentially have no DNA in any extended offspring? It's possible. I would say it's not likely. If she had 6 children, some of it has probably been passed down, but it's definitely likely that it hasn't passed to all of her descendants. It's theoretically possible that nobody got it, but it'd be pretty unlikely. If she had 6 children and she would have a lot of descendants, the thought of it not being transmitted at all seems pretty unlikely. Theoretically possible, but pretty unlikely. But it is entirely possible that you didn't inherit her DNA, but some of your other cousins probably did. And that is why it's so great to test as many people as you can, because all of our DNA is unique. All of our match lists are going to be unique. We can learn things from different people taking the test.
Other questions from anybody in person here?
We have another one here in the Q&A. If DNA sort of disappears 5 to 6 generations out, how can my ancestry include Vikings? I don't think anyone has trees back that far, especially in my family. I'm talking about an Irish family ancestry on my mom's side. I know there was pillaging in the old days, but how could you check? Well, first off, your ancestry doesn't, or your DNA doesn't entirely disappear after 5 or 6 generations, because obviously there were all of our DNA came from somewhere. So even though we may not have DNA from all of our ancestors, and we may not have a lot from all of our ancestors, we definitely do have DNA from ancestors who lived 300 generations ago. We do, it's just not a lot. So it's hard to pinpoint how much of it came from people that far back in time and who they were, because there's no paper trail to pinpoint it. That's one thing that's important to remember about DNA, is that you can't really use it without paper. Sometimes when I talk about DNA, I will put up my dad and my son and me. My dad and my son have the same name, and I share the same amount of DNA with both of them. And if I don't know their last name, they have the same first name, but they have different last names. If I don't know their last name or their ages, how do you know which one is my son, which Daniel is my son, and which Daniel is my father? Because the DNA doesn't tell us. It just shows that They could both be my sons, or one of them is maybe my father, but you still need other information to use it. Even something as simple as knowing one is 18 and one is 70 would nail it for all of us. We would know which is which. So we can see, because of population data, that yes, oftentimes people in Ireland have Scandinavian DNA, but we don't know exactly which Scandinavian that came from, which Viking was that. But being a Viking is the most logical explanation for that all to happen based on history. And I do definitely have some of my DNA matches where our common, we both have really robust trees. And in some cases, the only common ancestor we can find is 9 or 10 generations back. So in some cases, some of our DNA matches can point that far back in time, because we all have to get our DNA from somewhere. And our, fifth great grandparents got it from somewhere too. And we probably do have some of that DNA in us. It's just being able to identify who those people were using paper records, because our DNA doesn't have our name on it. Our birth certificate has our name on it. So we still need that paper trail to help us with that. Now, the people online, I've got lots of questions here. Why is my heritage more commonly done in Norway and Europe? Is it related to privacy laws? I don't know if it really has anything to do with privacy laws necessarily. I just think my heritage has done a better job marketing in the rest of the world. Ancestry has cornered North America for sure. But my heritage, since they're based out of Israel, they're a little geographically closer to Europe. And they've done a really good job marketing in Europe, and the Europeans like that test. I do have a handful of DNA matches that are from Europe on Ancestry, but definitely my heritage is where they're all testing. Oh, and somebody says here, Ancestry guesses who the common ancestor is with your matches. Are they just making this guess based on who is currently in your tree? Seems like you still need non-DNA documentation to be sure. Yes, they are just making that guess based on what's in your tree and in your matches tree and in all the other trees as well. And my heritage is doing the same thing. They're looking at all of the trees people have submitted, and they're saying, you share DNA with John Smith and you both have someone in your family tree named Tom Jones. They're kind of from the same place and kind of the same age. I bet that's what it is. And they're not always right. I have a DNA match that's driving me nuts. Ancestry has given me, that pretty through line showing that my dad and my grandma are descended from this person, and my DNA match is descended from that person. And they're right. That is absolutely true, except my dad and his mom don't share any DNA with a DNA match. My mom and her dad do, though. So I know it's on my mom's side of the family, not my dad's side, where the DNA is coming from, but I can't follow the paper trail. I can't figure that out. So I'm undoubtedly related to this person twice. Both of my parents are related to them, but the DNA is coming from my mom, because my mom and my grandpa's sister all match this person, and my dad and his sister and his aunt, and none of them do. So I know that the through line is wrong, and Ancestry has that information. They have all those tests, but that's not what they're using. They're just looking at my family tree and they're giving me the easy answer. And so sometimes it's a great time saver. I always look at my through lines, but I don't trust them until I've gone through it to make sure it's correct. Somebody says, should I upload the Ancestry DNA results to my heritage or just retest? My heritage has gotten really inexpensive. I think for Mother's Day, they've got it on sale for under $40. And if you transfer it, it's going to cost you 20. So I don't know, for an additional $20, you can just get a fresh test if you want to. I don't know if it's worth the extra $20, but it's gotten so affordable. You could really go either way on that. All of mine are uploads. I didn't buy separate tests for mine. I just uploaded the Ancestry test to my heritage, and I'm getting great results. So it'll be faster to do it that way. One thing to think about, one of the things that's nice about the MyHeritage test is you don't have to spit in the tube. It's a cheek swab. So if you have someone who struggles with producing saliva and doing that test, MyHeritage is nice because it's a cheek swab and it might be easier to collect the sample. So that is something that maybe would swing people toward one test or the other. Why is there a difference in the likelihood of sharing DNA with 23andMe and with Ancestry? And this is referring to the chart that's in the handout. Ancestry and 23andMe do not look at the exact, neither one of them looks at your entire genome. Neither one of them is looking at every single gene that's in your body. They're only looking at certain parts, and they're not looking at the same ones, which is why those are different, because they're not looking at the exact same genes. That's the short answer. If they were looking at the exact same parts of your genome, then they would be the same. But since they're looking at different spots, we're getting some slight differences there. Let's see, in the next question, couldn't the lack of European DNA also be that people tended not to move around as much as we do, especially emigrating to the US? They probably knew their families through old records and stories that we find hard to find. That's a great point. Europeans are not quite as excited about genealogy and DNA testing as Americans because they often have that deep sense of connection to the place where they live, and they don't just have this constant message being blasted at them all the time that your ancestors came from somewhere else. And I'm not saying that's wrong, because it's absolutely true. Our ancestors did come from somewhere else. But we are raised with that knowledge from birth, where Europeans are often raised with, our families have been here for centuries, and we belong to this place. And that is interesting. At NAGC, our librarian is from Norway, and she's just like, I don't understand why you guys are so interested in this. And I'm like, Sigrid, you grew up there. We didn't. We're disconnected by 5 generations, but there's this mythology about it. So I think you're absolutely right that Europeans already feel like they know the answer, because so many people who take a DNA test are just doing it for that ethnicity result, and that's all the farther they look at first. So if you already know that you're Italian, you might think, what's the point? And I've actually talked to a lot of Americans who say, well, I already know I'm German. Why should I take the test? And I'll say, well, because how are adoptees ever going to, be able to use this test if people who don't know their family don't take the test? But when people say, why should I do it? My answer is always, well, the same reason you should look at obituaries, and the same reason you should look at tax records, and the same reason you should look at the census. It's another tool. If somebody said to any experienced genealogist and said, I never look at the census because I already know, you would say, what? Why wouldn't you look at it? It's another tool. It's an important tool. That's kind of how I feel about DNA. It's another tool, and it's an important tool. It can help us fill in gaps that the paper records don't. Oh, and we got a question here. How much of a centimorgan match is too little? Less than 10? Question mark. It depends on what you're trying to find out. Ancestry won't show you any matches that are lower than 8, because once you get below 8, there's a very real possibility that the only reason you share DNA with that person is random chance. So that's why they only show you 8 and above. It depends on your goals. Some people have so many big matches, so many close matches, they never get to those small numbers. But if you don't have a lot of big numbers, those little numbers, those distant matches might be all you have to work with. If somebody shares 10 centimorgans with you, you probably do have a common ancestor. It just might be pretty far back. But then again, if we look at our chart here, someone who only shares 10 centimorgans with you might be your 4th cousin. And 4th cousin isn't that far back. That's not that far away from you. So I wouldn't say 10 is too little. I would just say it depends on what your objective is, what you're trying to learn, what you're trying to find. If you're hoping to find your birth father, I would not look at centimorgan matches that low. I would look at things over 100 because you're looking for someone who's really closely related to you. But if you're looking for your fifth great grandparent, I would definitely be looking at those small matches because those are the people who it could be. Those are maybe the ones who are the key to unlock that secret, to solve that mystery. That was it for the Q&A questions. All right. Well, thank you. Oh, touching the microphone, making all.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us, both our in-person folks and our virtual folks. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Appreciate Dana coming all the way from Madison and sharing her knowledge on DNA with us. So we hope to see you again next month on June 12th when we talk about gravestone symbolism. And a reminder, that's a Thursday evening instead of a Saturday afternoon. So see you again.
Thank you.